With the wide availability of GIS technology these days, nearly anyone can create a map. But as a quick search on the internet will reveal, not all maps are created equal. Some maps truly do communicate with their audience more effectively than others. Therefore, in this video, we will be covering some key points that one should keep in mind when trying to effectively communicate using cartography. First and foremost, any person creating a map should be mindful of what is the purpose of the map. Essentially, what is the map trying to communicate, and how will the cartographer communicate it? Being very mindful of this and the purpose of every map is very important because it informs several decisions that the cartographer has to make when working through the cartographic design process. First of all, it's important to consider what spatial data will be included on a map, how it will be arranged, how it will impact the audience, and what the audience's attention will immediately be drawn to on the map. This brings in concerns of cartographic design. What design strategies will be employed in order to effectively communicate with the audience? All of this comes back to the map's overarching purpose. Before creating a map, any cartographer should be able to very concisely and very articulately explain what the purpose of the map is. Second, it's important to be mindful of a map's audience. One can be mindful of the purpose without being mindful of the audience, because effective communication involves not just presenting the information in a way that you find intelligible, but actually presenting it in a manner in which the audience that you're targeting would find intelligible. As you can imagine, different maps have widely different audiences, and the structures of the maps, therefore, should reflect that. A map created for this class can be designed very differently from a map that will be designed for publication in National Geographic. That is, of course, an extreme example, but you can imagine that when you're thinking just about maps available for public consumption on the internet, being very mindful of the audience and who you're targeting can make the difference between a map that reaches an audience of 5 people versus an audience of 5 million. It's also particularly important these days with the advent of web cartography to consider what is the map's medium. In this class, we'll be focused primarily on maps that will be created using ArcGIS in the desktop environment, and therefore we'll be getting static print quality output. But there are some maps these days that are web-based and highly interactive. In those cases, being mindful of the medium is important because that medium offers several different possibilities that the traditional format of print cartography does not. Finally, when working professionally, it's very important to be mindful of time and budget constraints. A large cartography project can eat into a budget and can consume far too much of a person's time if a person does not effectively constrain the project from the beginning by considering these very important constraints. A great way to get started on effective map design and effective map communication is to review some basic map elements that we've already covered in the Layout View screencast. So when creating a map in this class, there are several elements which your map should include the majority of the time. First of all, for this course, you should always make sure to include your name on the map. Next, your map should almost always include a title. There are very few cases, even professionally, where a map should not include a title. Truly, adding a title to a map is paramount to communicating the purpose of the map with the audience. And so I don't think there are any maps in this course for which titles should not be added. You should almost always include the source of the map data if your source is external. You should almost always include a legend as well, particularly if you have more than one data layer and the data layer is not immediately apparent to the audience what is being represented. Particularly if you're representing numerical values on a map in one form or another, a legend is very important. And legends are also very important on reference maps that as I mentioned, do include many layers. A scale bar is optional depending on the purpose of the map. A thematic map focusing on economic issues might not need a scale bar, whereas a map showing hiking trails in the San Bernardino Mountains in California certainly might benefit from a scale bar. And then one map element that is I think falling out of favor a little bit in cartography is a north arrow. A north arrow is optional, it's not usually needed, and it's particularly needed in cases where it is not immediately obvious to the audience the orientation of the map. So the audience typically assumes that north is up, and in many cases when we look at geometry that we recognize, it's very apparent that that's the case, and in that case a north arrow is visually redundant. But in cases where it is not obvious, you can err on the side of caution and include a north arrow. Finally, most maps should include a neat line, particularly where the geometry overlaps the boundaries of the neat line. That means that when the contents of a layer extend beyond the neat line and there is therefore some unvisualized content or content left off of that map, then the neat line should be there to show where the map begins and where it ends. Now that we have finished designing a map that reflects sound cartographic design principles, we can move forward with the process of creating print quality output of this map. This involves creating a page layout that includes common map elements. In order to accomplish this, we have to switch over to another mode of ArcGIS called the Layout View. And the Layout View is accessible by clicking a button right at the bottom of the data frame. If we switch over to the Layout View, you will see that ArcMap will already try to, at its very best, place your map into a page layout. And then from this point forward, our work will involve customizing this and making it look as appropriate as possible given the circumstances. Typically, we want to pick a page orientation that fits best with the geometry at hand. If you have a region or a country or an area of focus that is vertically elongated, then we would want to choose portrait page orientation. If we have an area that is horizontally elongated, then we would choose landscape page orientation. Given that Spain generally falls in the middle but is slightly more horizontally elongated, especially considering some of its islands, then we would switch over to landscape page orientation. This is as simple as right-clicking within the frame and choosing Page and Print Setup. We then have the ability to choose a paper size, and we could choose letter, and then choose landscape page orientation. We will then want to reposition our map frame. That's relatively straightforward. We'll just zoom out until we can see that top corner. Note that we now have a layout toolbar with parameters and tools that allow us to change just the layout instead of the contents of the layout. So we have this tool here that lets us zoom in and out on the layout itself, not just the contents of the map. Then we can just get this to the point where we can see everything that we want to see. Then we can switch back to the Select Elements tool. We can select this tool and then we can drag around on our frame such that we are roughly centering this. We have the ability to choose between mapping with the full extent of the page or just a portion of it. If we map over the full extent of the page, then we would place our map elements on the inside of the frame. If not, then we would place them typically just outside or on the periphery. Now that we have this configured as such, we can zoom in. Note that this time we want to use the zoom tools here at the top of the page, as these will zoom in within the data frame. And that is certainly what we want. We don't want to zoom in just on the page layout. We want the contents of the map to be zoomed in, and that allows us to accomplish that. Note that up here we have the representative fraction scale of the map. When we just zoomed in automatically, that gave us 6,002,823. I would strongly suggest adjusting your scale to a nice round number so that we can include that as the scale in a text caption somewhere on the map. Now that we have all of this set up, we can start adding some map elements and also customizing the contents of the map. The first thing we can do is insert a title. To do this, we would just go to the Insert menu and choose Title. We could just call it Spain and Vicinity, something of that nature, and then click OK. The title will be placed, and then we can reposition that. Note that we have the same options for customizing the output as we do for any of the features. So we have a title there, and then we could create a subtitle for it if you would like. We could then add a text box, and that text box could be customized to say cartography by, and then your name. This isn't required, it's just a nice little feature that sometimes you can use to make your map, well, certainly attribute the map such that it's clear who made it. It's important to try to line things up as much as possible. So if we're going to be placing a title and a subtitle, we want to roughly have them in line. Note that you can nudge features with your keyboard, and then you can also manually adjust the placement just by dragging them using the select features or select elements tool right here. So if I drag this down into place, we can see that things are starting to come together. Now we can make some further adjustments. So additional map elements that are common: we have a neat line already around the frame itself. We have a title, we have a subtitle. We also want to think about adding a scale bar and a legend. So let's add a scale bar next. The scale bar gives you several different options here. Given that we are mapping Europe in this case, we'll go with a metric scale bar, and we can just add that as such here on the bottom of the map. And again, we'll try to keep things relatively corner justified. So maybe we could place that here, just beneath the map on that corner. And then we can also add scale text that will give us the representative fraction scale. So this is showing our scale here as 1 inch equals 94.7 miles. I'm going to delete that and try again because I just want the representative fraction of 1 to 6 million, because that's an awfully clean and attractive way to express this. So again, we can modify the scale here. We could just say absolute scale instead of relative scale. And we can place that right beneath our scale bar. Now we can work on adding a legend. We then have the ability to decide what we want to include in our legend and what we want to omit. In this case, I don't believe we need to include everything, because it's relatively clear what is Spain and what are neighboring countries. So we can just omit Spain, and we can omit the neighboring countries. However, all of the other layers we can include. We don't necessarily need a title for the legend. And let's just see how this looks. We can always come back and modify these properties later on. Our legend is appearing here. And one thing that is important to note is that it is possible and acceptable in some cases to place your legend inside the frame of your map, even if you're overlapping some features, as long as you're not overlapping the primary area of focus on the map. So if we were to set this up, we could do so in a very justified way. We might want to consider adding a border around it, as well as adding a white background. And then if we apply this, you can see that's looking very much like an appropriate legend placement. We might want to add a little bit of a buffer around some of the features as well, so we can add a gap, an X and Y gap. We'll try 4 points. And actually, we'll want to make that around the background. There we go. That looks quite good. We could even position this just a little higher up. And note now that we have some legend text that doesn't necessarily reflect how we would want this to be displayed to an end user. We just have layer names. We can modify this though such that the layer names that are appearing in the legend better reflect a human readable representation of these layers. So we can just rename each layer individually. That's very easy. We just go into layer properties. On the general tab, we can modify the layer name. So we can say capital cities, populated places, and note that as I rename these in the table of contents, they are renamed in our legend as well. Rivers. That's just shrunk our legend a little bit because that was our longest bit of text. And then urban areas. Then we can move this back into its appropriate corner. And then, of course, we can make any modifications we want to. We could move around the contents of the map just a little bit. Such that we are kind of centering things as much as possible. Now, to me, that looks quite good. We could also experiment with putting the legend outside of the map and placing the legend on a couple of different lines. But in this case, I think this looks pretty good for now. Now, one other thing to consider is the addition of a north arrow. Given that this is a reference map and direction is important, I think adding a north arrow could be certainly appropriate. Some of these are a bit unattractive, so you might want to consider one that looks pretty reasonable and is non-obtrusive. I like this one right here. We could just place this in the lower left-hand corner of the map area, and that will be a clear indication of the orientation of the map. The more I look at this, the more I think I might like to fine-tune some additional details, including the legend, since it is overlapping a lot of Algeria here. Even though it's not so important, at least it would be nice if we could see the country's name and perhaps the capital city a little better. So we could take our legend and split it out over different columns. It's a relatively straightforward process. Just open up the properties for the legend, and then for each of the items in the legend, we'll just say place item in a new column. Let's just give that a try and see what we think. That extends the legend out and gives us the ability to see a little more of the area of the map. In just a moment, we can customize the placement of the country labels so that we can see the labels for Morocco and for Algeria. But I'd say that that is much better than the larger legend that was taking up more space. So with that set, let's go ahead and make some fine-tuning adjustments to the map. We have a pretty good looking map layout at this point, but as I mentioned, some of our labeling is a little bit suboptimal. I think for the country labels in particular, I would like to adjust nearly all of them, except perhaps for the label of France, which looks like it's occupying some nice empty space. So again, we'll save our progress here, as it is always good to do. And then we can make some modifications. In order to customize the placement of labels, we have to first convert the labels into graphical representations of the text. That's not a very difficult process, but do note that once this is done, we would have to change around the labels completely or automatically regenerate them all if we wanted to modify any of the label placement going forward. So if we wanted to convert the country labels into graphics that we could manually adjust, we would then right-click on the layer, choose Convert Labels to Annotation, and we'll store them here in the map for storing annotation, and we'll create them for all features. We'll choose Convert. That process is completed. Note that we should get something saying Overflow Annotation. That's very common just for features that we cannot see the labels for at the moment. And then we'll want to open up a new toolbar that allows us to modify the graphics. To that end, we just have to open up the Customize menu, Toolbars, and then Draw. I'm just going to drag this right into my bar at the top, and then note that we have this list of tools here that can be very useful for modifying these graphics manually. We can go through then and manually remove some of these labels that we don't want. To do that, we'll go back to our data view. And then we can select the labels individually. So I could select the label here for Spain. And I could move it to a more appropriate and empty location on the map. You would see that same modification made in the layout view if we switch back to it. Likewise, some of these labels, I think we could stand to remove altogether. Let's just toggle that, get this back, go back to the data view. I think we could stand, for example, to remove the label for Andorra altogether, since it is taking up a lot of space. Likewise, we can remove the label for Gibraltar. And if we go back to the layout view, we'll see what a significant improvement that has made in terms of making some of the labels more readable. We're still missing a couple of labels, it seems, and we might want to even reposition some of them further. So in the process of doing this, we lost the label for France. I believe it probably moved up closer to the center of the country. So we'll just move that around, drag that back down to where we want it. And then we can do the same here for Morocco and Algeria. And the label for Algeria is way down there, so we'll move that up. And then we'll do our best to restore our view. And I'm thinking we might need to slide some of these around a little more. But let's take a look at our view in the layout mode and see how things are looking. Well, quite close. At this point, I think the best thing to do might just be to make some adjustments right here. And it looks like really we could just bring France down a little bit, Algeria up, and Morocco over, and we should be in good shape for the country labels. We could even fine-tune Portugal a little bit. I didn't notice that before, but the label for Portugal is touching a couple of city locations, so we can move that up and make that even cleaner. Now we'll move back to the layout view. And I would say that that looks quite good. Well, except for the fact that we lost a little bit of the label for Morocco, so we'll go back and fine-tune that. Note that this is the cartographic design process. It just takes iteration, it takes work in order to make your maps appear the way that you want them to. If a map isn't taking some manual effort, then it's probably not being done as well as it could be done. Slide back to the layout view, and that's looking much better. The only thing I might do at this point is make a slight adjustment to center things as much as possible, and I would consider that to be essentially ready to go. Note that there are some issues with some of the other layers labels. The placement of some of the city labels could be improved a bit, and note that for the capitals layer we actually have duplicate labels for the smaller cities and the capitals. We could just go in and remove those from the smaller city layer. That would be a bit more of a process, though, that since I've already demonstrated that process, keep that in mind that that's something you would want to do to fine-tune your work, but for the sake of demonstration, we'll just wrap this process up right now with a demonstration of exporting this map. So we would save our work. Then when we're ready to export this as a print quality map, we would choose Export Map from the File menu, and then choose ideally the PDF format, and save it wherever we want to save it. I'll just save it here on the desktop, keep things really easy. And the resolution is good to set at least 300 dpi, as long as your file size ends up being reasonable after that. Note that you can also save your map as an image in many different formats, including a JPEG. And you can specify the image compression quality if you ever need to export a map in a quality or at a resolution that is more suitable for sharing via the web. We can go ahead and save this though, And you'll note that the export will be complete when you see the message export complete at the lower left corner. With that, you can go and open your PDF and verify that everything worked properly. In the end, you should see a very crisp and clean looking reference map for the country of your choice. You should see all of the labels in the positions that are specified, and everything should look essentially like this with all of your map elements properly included.